Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. We are reminded every day of that old political adage that elections have consequences. What we forget sometimes is the predicate of that statement, that campaigns also have consequences. In part, it's why we're always so fascinated by campaigns and why some of our seminal political texts have been written about campaigns and campaigning. From Teddy White's The Making of the President series to Clifton White and Joe McGinnis, from Hunter Thompson and the remarkable Richard Ben Cramer, getting behind the scenes of a national political campaign is the ultimate understanding of how things work. In this unrivaled political campaign season that we've just been through, the first out of the gate with such a look are my guests, reporters Jonathan Allen and Amy Parnes. Jonathan Allen has covered national politics for Politico, Bloomberg, and Vox. He's the head of community and content for Sidewire and writes a weekly political column for Roll Call. Amy Parnes is the senior White House correspondent for The Hill, and together they're the authors of Shattered, Inside Hillary Clinton's Doomed Campaign. Jonathan, Amy, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
It's our pleasure.
It's great to have you here. First of all, before we get into some of the individual stories, one of the things about this campaign, it was certainly true of both sides and certainly seems particularly true of the Clinton campaign, as the two of you write about it, that there was a certain sense of soullessness to all of this that in some ways reflected the realities of the campaign as you write about it, but also represented a kind of broader soullessness of our political culture today. Talk a little bit about that first. Jonathan, start with you.
Well, I think that's right. We've gotten to a place in our politics where we really try and slice and dice the electorate. The two parties try to turn out their bases. We saw some persuasion efforts by Donald Trump, for sure, but the Clinton folks, I think, believed that they'd found the magical formula for winning by painting by numbers. Through the Obama era and into the Clinton era, and I think. Her campaign was not, we write about this in detail, the struggles that her campaign had coming up with a message that voters perceived to be more about the voters than about Hillary Clinton. And the irony, I think, when you talk about soullessness, is I think the campaign itself had some soullessness in terms of the way that they went about things. But I really believe that Hillary Clinton's humanity kind of bleeds through in this book. I mean, her character traits, her unique character traits, which some are flaws, some are strengths, some are both things. I think they really come out in this book in a way that that sometimes she's even had trouble showing herself. But obviously the campaign was disastrous.
And Amy, there's a certain irony in what Jonathan says, and I think it's correct and a credit to both of you that humanity does come through in Shattered. But this is the irony sometimes of politics. There was, and both of you may remember the documentary about Mitt Romney that came out after the campaign, and everybody said, well, if we had seen that Mitt Romney, we might have voted for him. And the same is consistent with what Jonathan is saying about Hillary Clinton. Why did she have such a hard time conveying that, much as Romney did, as other politicians have had sometimes in the past?
I think, that's totally right. People like her when she's not political, when she's away from politics. When she was Secretary of State, as we wrote about in our first book, for instance, she was viewed. She had very high polling and ratings, and I think her popularity soared then. But, as someone told her back then, as soon as you step back into national politics, I think, you're going to see your poll numbers drop a bit. And sure enough, they did. I think, with her, it's interesting. People, she brings out visceral reactions in people. Obviously, everyone knows how they feel about Hillary Clinton. She's one of those people, and there's a double standard, I think, with her as well, where there was a lot of people are viewing this her losses partly due to misogyny, and I think there's some truth to that.
To what extent did the campaign understand the strategic challenges they faced more than just the tactical issues of the campaign, Amy?
I think, it's very hard to actually, this was one of the big challenges of the book that we tried to sort of pull back and see what the big challenges were. But I think basically, I think message was a huge one, and it was something that haunted her from the start. She was when they were preparing her speech on Roosevelt Island, her launch speech, it was she brought in a lot of advisors to help her with the speech, and she, even then they struggled to sort of depict why, in fact, she was running for president, and that was a struggle that I think followed her throughout the primary and into the general election. They also were reliant on. She wanted evidence-based facts and proof of her path forward, and I think she relied on data analytics to sort of to drive what she was doing on every level, and I think that hurt her as well.
And that goes in some ways to the soullessness, Jonathan. Talk a little bit about so many of these mistakes, some of which Amy was just touching on, that were repeated from her failed effort in 2008.
Well, it's interesting. She made a huge effort to break from 2008, as Amy was alluding to. And so in some cases, she overlearned lessons. Barack Obama ran circles around her on technology. So this time around, she got a bunch of data scientists to tell her how to win the election, and they had gotten probably too much credit for Obama's victory, and she ended up over-relying, according to some of the people on her campaign, over-relying on what she was getting from them. And in other instances, she was unable, and then particularly the biggest instance, unable to really break from 2008, and that was to provide a raison d'etre for her campaign, to basically tell the public what is the compelling reason for Hillary Clinton to be president now. I mean, especially after having run 8 years prior, there needed to be some message that said, this is why me and why now. What is the unique thing that Hillary Clinton can bring to the presidency that will deliver for voters? And obviously she came very close to winning. She won a majority of the popular vote. Whatever it was she was doing was good for a lot of voters, but those upper Midwest voters that ended up being the swing in this election, were not convinced. And, message was a huge problem for her in 2008, and it was again in 2016.
To what extent did Bill Clinton understand the failure of that message, Jonathan?
I think he got it. He was out traveling the country some and talking to allies in parts of the country, and they kept telling him that they weren't, that his wife wasn't totally resonating with people. He wanted to go out and persuade folks that were undecided or were against his wife, and he kept hearing from the campaign that it was better to go to big cities and try to just turn out Democratic voters.
Who was it, Amy, that gave her some of the worst advice?
That's a really good question, but I think there are several people blamed here. I think one of them, the person who got the most blame, I think, is Robbie Mook, because, as John said, he was so reliant on data analytics, and I think Huma Abedin, who is her longtime aide, also got some of the blame, because I think she played the role of gatekeeper. And played it a little too well, I think, in that messages weren't relayed to Secretary Clinton, and she wasn't hearing from people below her on where the problem areas were and what was happening on the ground. And so I think people do point fingers at both of them primarily.
To that point, Amy, there was a memo that you guys talk about that was circulated at some point in the campaign that basically said, contrary to whatever you think, Donald Trump can win.
Yeah, and it was for whatever reason, I think, largely ignored. I think this advisor wanted to actually kind of shake people up and make them realize that that this excitement around him was real. And they, of course, were looking at Bernie Sanders at the same time and seeing a similar kind of excitement. It was sort of the cycle of the outsider. And I think when you look back at that memo, that person obviously was onto something.
To what extent, Jonathan, was so much of the campaign reactive, both to Bernie Sanders in the primary and of course, to Trump later? How many decisions that were made were just based on reaction to events?
I actually think there was a fair amount of strategic planning that went into what they did, and obviously some of it's reactive. You got to react to your rivals. I think they were taken a little bit by surprise by both Sanders and Trump. I don't, obviously in the general election, it can go either way. So, I mean, they knew they were going to, at a certain point, knew they were going to face Trump. They had to react to Bernie Sanders because they underestimated him. But there were also strategies that they were working on that were proactive, and some of them worked and some of them didn't. Her delegate strategy in the primaries was very effective at helping her win the Democratic nomination, as we detail in the book, sort of how that worked, and how it also that same strategy came back to bite her a little bit with working class white voters in the general election. And then with Trump, that she had dumped a ton of money into advertising in August, and Trump wasn't playing at all on TV. So eventually they reacted to that and pared back a little, just as Trump was amping things up. But they did have a proactive strategy. It just didn't always things didn't play out as they anticipated all the time, and certainly not on election night.
Talk a little bit, Jonathan, about the sense that the Obama White House, and particularly the political operatives that were A, in the White House, and B, that had worked for Obama politically in the past, how they perceived what Clinton was doing in this campaign.
Well, it's a little bit of a mix, because some of them went to work for her, and those who went to work for her on the campaign, to a person, are flattering of her. They don't want to indicate that they made a mistake in backing her, and I think some of them, feel real affinity for her. Then there's a set that stayed at the White House, and I think most of those are the folks that really didn't feel like they could get behind her candidacy. I don't mean that they couldn't vote for her, but that they, didn't feel that strong affinity toward her. And then there's some outside advisors. John Favreau, the White House speechwriter under Obama, had worked on her first speech and came away kind of shaking his head at all of the dysfunction internally, and the fact they had about a dozen people working on the first speech, and her inability to sort of articulate what it was she wanted to bring the country. And so there were folks like that too. So it was kind of a mixed bag among Obama world, and I think that's reflective of a larger ambivalence or sort of mix of feelings among Obama voters about Hillary Clinton.
One of the things that you talk about a lot in various respects with regard to the campaign, Amy, is this valuing of loyalty, sometimes loyalty even over competence. Talk about that.
Right, and it's something that we talk about actually in our first book as well, where the Clintons had set up a hit list, an enemies list of people who were loyal to them and who weren't. Loyalty is huge to them. But I think in this particular campaign, we detail how loyalty, once again, it was a major storyline, but there were kind of different factions of people. As John just mentioned, there were the Obama people and other Democrats who were sort of, we call them the missionaries and the mercenaries. There were people who were in her camp where they were drinking the Kool-Aid, and then there were others who came to actually carry out this mission. And I think, as we talked about earlier, I think Huma Abedin was sort of the gatekeeper, and had to sort of listen to people and hear what the problems were, and never quite relayed those messages to Secretary Clinton. And I think that was a main problem of the campaign, that she didn't really have someone who could actually speak truth to her and tell her exactly, a David Axelrod like Obama had, who could kind of tell her exactly what was what and what was happening and what she needed to do. And that, I think, really hurt her in the campaign.
What about Bill Clinton? Wasn't he able to fill that role? Amy?
I think that he basically was sounding the alarm quite a bit, particularly when he was on the ground and was hearing different things from allies, things that they should have been doing. So he was very vocal in this. But, they kept him on a pretty tight leash this time around, because I think in 2008 they felt like he was hurting the campaign a bit and was going off message. He did that a little bit this time around as well, but I think for the most part he was kind of right in his assessment of what was happening on the ground, and that they should have been deploying him to other places.
To what extent, Jonathan, did they understand the Trump voter? Did they understand what was going on in the country and understand why he was getting the kind of crowds he got, the kind of reaction he got, the sense that none of the bad stuff was sticking? How did they perceive that?
Well, we detail this in the book about how Hillary Clinton really didn't get it in February of 2015, after she got got hammered in the New Hampshire primary, she brought a friend of hers aboard her plane, Mignon Moore, who would later join the campaign as a top advisor, and said to Mignon in sort of a moment of confidence, I don't really understand what's happening with the country. I can't get my arms around it. I mean, she could see what was going on with Trump appealing to people. She could see what Bernie was doing to appeal to people, and this was just so anathema to her way of thinking about the American voter. She believes very strongly in making change through the system, and she had seen that in her lifetime. Particularly, she's talked about before with the civil rights era, where you have President Johnson working pretty hard on the inside on those things. And so it was a struggle for her to understand it. She had a number of moments through the campaign where she had trouble understanding it. Ultimately, the strategy, as we detail in the book, was for her to disqualify Donald Trump, and she thought that would be enough to defeat him. And it turned out, 1 in 5 Trump voters said that they thought he wasn't really fit for the presidency, and yet voted for him. And I think that shows a lack of understanding of just how frustrated people were with the system and how much they'd rejected the idea that you could go into the existing system and make change from it rather than breaking it down and rebuilding it.
How much, Jonathan, was the campaign tied down to the traditional ideas of, for lack of a better definition, identity politics that had defined the Democratic Party?
I think very tied down to it. I mean, I think this is a campaign where each group within the Democratic Party, each part of that coalition has a voice and a strong voice, and I think there has been a desire to create parity among those voices, certainly from those voices, and I think it made it hard sometimes for the campaign to shift its emphasis here, or shift its emphasis there. Donald Trump was so adroit, and in terms of changing his direction when he needed to, and Hillary Clinton had a tougher time doing that because if she, gave more attention to one set, she was giving less attention to another set, and ultimately the one that she essentially ignored was the working class whites.
Amy, talk a little bit about Brexit, which happened roughly, I don't remember exactly, a month or so before Election Day, and whether anybody paid attention to that in the Clinton campaign.
I think Bill Clinton was the biggest, was sounding the biggest alarm on Brexit. He was basically interested in what was happening over there. And even on election night, after she lost, he was bringing up Brexit again. And it's funny because a lot of people, even since then, are looking at Brexit and at the French elections, and they're saying, this is kind of the year of the outsider, and they're basically making the point that maybe if Bernie Sanders actually was in the race against Trump, that he could have won because this is sort of what people want. There's this rise of populism happening. The excitement around both of their campaigns was the thing that was, I guess, most interesting to a lot of folks who were covering the campaigns. And so it's interesting, though, that that Bill Clinton was fixated almost on this and predicted that it might happen over here. When the campaign itself, when you talk to people as it was happening, they were less concerned. They were saying, well, that's a different that's a really different thing that's happening over there. It's not going to happen here.
Was there ever any talk, Jonathan, of picking a vice presidential candidate that was more reflective of this outsiderness, this populism, if not Bernie Sanders, that even a more establishment kind of populist, somebody like Sherrod Brown, et cetera? Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, I think she wanted to shake up her ticket a little bit, and we actually talked about that in the book and did some new reporting on Elizabeth Warren making sort of a late run up the short list. But as it turned out, that wasn't the choice for her. I think that there's, certainly something to be said for the idea that either as a vice presidential candidate or perhaps if one of these more populist Democrats had been nominated, that would have improved the Democrats' chances of winning.
Amy, talk a little bit about to what extent she understood populism and even Bernie Sanders' appeal. Put Trump aside for the moment.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think she ever really understood what was happening until it was almost too late. We talked about this scene in the book where she is actually saying, as John mentioned, that she can't really wrap her arms around what's happening in the electorate. She doesn't quite understand it. It was a theme that actually, it was a really poignant moment in the book, I think, because she... I think she's, that's a moment where we see what she's thinking, where she can't quite come to terms with it. And when she does, it's almost like she can't, because she's not the outside candidate. She's a Clinton. They've been involved in politics for decades now, and everyone has an opinion of her. So it was really hard, even when Bill Clinton was kind of making the case that she could kind of fill that role. It's hard for her to, and I think that was definitely problematic. That everyone wanted someone else, I think, and I think that's something the party is examining right now. It's one of the lessons, I think, the big takeaways, that you can't really have someone who is the inevitable candidate who, just because it's their time, so to speak. You need, I think a lot of people want fresh blood, and they want someone exciting and dynamic to kind of mix it up a little bit. And people thinking about Barack Obama and what he did in 2008 and how he was able to capture all that excitement, I think that's what the party is aiming toward going forward.
There's, of course, Jonathan, the danger in that it becomes too much of, and we already have enough of it, and in many ways what we have reflects this, that politics and entertainment have become conflated in a way that's pretty frightening.
Yeah, and that's not an entirely new thing. I mean, we saw Jesse the Body Ventura elected governor of Minnesota about 15 years ago or so, and then we saw Arnold Schwarzenegger elected governor of California, and I would say some mixed results in there. I think Jesse the Body Ventura was less successful as governor of Minnesota than Schwarzenegger was in California. But yeah, we seem to be moving to a place where celebrity is a credential. It's a qualifier for other venues, and it's interesting to watch that happen in our culture and our politics. And I guess we'll see if it works. If it works out well, then we'll see more of it, and if it doesn't, we'll probably see a little less of it.
Jonathan, why was she never able to come up with a strategy of any kind to shake the email server issue?
I think mostly I think there were two things at work here. Number one, the best legal advice and the best political advice were at odds. The best legal advice was to say as little as possible. The best political advice was to apologize. In apologizing, though, you might be handing a prosecutor or even just your political opponents a cudgel with which to batter you. I think that was part of it. I think she also didn't think she'd done anything wrong. She thinks like a lawyer, so there was no penalty, no real legal penalty for setting up the server the way that she did. If classified information hadn't traveled through it, there certainly wouldn't have been any talk of a criminal penalty for it. So I think in her mind, that makes it legal, or at least not illegal. So this is something where she thought she didn't do anything wrong. At least that's what she said to other people. It took her many months to apologize for it, and during that time, her credibility just took hit after hit after hit.
And finally, and I want to ask both of you, Jonathan, start with you, the biggest political takeaway from this campaign?
I think the biggest political takeaway from this campaign is that the candidate matters, and particularly with regard to the timing of the candidate. Who is the candidate that has the best message and motivation for the moment? And Hillary Clinton had run for president before and did not have a whole lot new that she was offering from the last time, even though the country had shifted a lot. So that's sort of my big takeaway.
Amy?
I think a lot of it, it's funny. I think the staff is a big one. And I also think that Secretary Clinton had all these self-inflicted wounds from email to her speeches. And so I think it had to be a mix of those two things. I think that the staff infighting that was happening, and while we're not saying it was happening, it was widespread. But, when your top two advisors can't get along, can't get on the same page, I think that's problematic. I also think that she should have she was someone who knew that she might run for president again when she set up the server, and basically lessons should be learned from this in doing that kind of thing.
Jonathan Allen, Amy Parnes, their book is Shattered: Inside Hillary Clinton's Doomed Campaign. Jonathan, Amy, I thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was our pleasure.